Imagine, if you will, stepping through the veil of time itself, emerging into a world where breath becomes visible prayer and survival is measured not in years, but in hours. This is Victorian London, 1847, where winter arrives not as a season but as a predator, stalking through fog-shrouded streets with supernatural hunger. You find yourself standing on cobblestones slick with ice and human desperation, watching as two worlds exist within touching distance yet separated by an ocean of indifference. In one realm, gaslights dance warmly behind silk curtains, casting golden shadows on mahogany furniture and crystal decanters. In the other, children press hollow faces against frost-covered windows, their breath the only warmth they'll know. Before we descend deeper into this frozen chronicle, pause with me for a moment. Where do you find yourself tonight as you listen to this tale? Perhaps you're nestled safely in your heated home in Toronto, or maybe you're walking through the mild winter of Sydney. Wherever you are, hold tight to that comfort, for what we're about to witness will make you grateful for every degree of warmth surrounding you. The story I'm about to tell isn't just history. It's a mirror held up to human nature itself, reflecting how power, privilege, and poverty dance their eternal waltz across the stage of human suffering. Chapter 1. When Breath Becomes Visible Prayer. The London of 1847 breathed like a dying giant, its exhalations rising in great plumes of yellow-grey fog that swallowed entire neighbourhoods whole. This wasn't merely weather. This was nature's own cruel judgment, a supernatural force that seemed to know exactly which doors to spare and which to claim. Picture walking these streets as dawn struggles to penetrate the gloom. Your footsteps echo off walls that weep with accumulated dampness, while somewhere in the distance church bells toll through the murk like ghostly warnings. The fog doesn't just obscure vision, it transforms London into a landscape of shadows and suggestions, where reality itself becomes negotiable. Here, in Mayfair, Lady Charlotte Pemberton awakens in a bedroom warmed by 3 separate fireplaces, their flames casting dancing shadows on silk wallpaper imported from Paris. The fog pressing against her windows appears romantic, almost mystical, as servants glide silently through heated hallways preparing her morning chocolate and warm pastries. Charlotte will later confide to her diary that winter mornings possess a certain ethereal beauty, the way frost paints delicate patterns on glass and fog softens the harsh edges of the city. For her, winter is poetry written in ice and shadow. 3 miles eastward, through streets that might as well exist on a different planet, Mary O'Connor opens eyes that haven't known peaceful sleep in months. The breath that clouds before her face in the dawn chill isn't romantic. It's evidence of a room so cold that survival itself becomes a daily miracle. Mary shares this single chamber with her husband Patrick, their 3 children, and Patrick's aging mother. The walls, thin as parchment and riddled with cracks, provide about as much protection from the elements as a moth's wing. Yet this hovel, miserable as it is, represents relative luxury compared to the streets where thousands sleep beneath newspapers and prayer. The contrast isn't merely economic, it's existential. Charlotte's fog is atmospheric decoration. Mary's is a killing machine that steals warmth from bone and hope from heart. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Suffering. Watch how the city itself becomes complicit in this tale of division. The very bricks and mortar seem to conspire with wealth against poverty, as if London's geography were designed by some malevolent deity with a twisted sense of justice. Westminster Palace rises like a golden monument to power, its Gothic spires piercing the winter sky while heated chambers inside buzz with parliamentary debates about the poor laws. Lord Hamilton speaks eloquently about the need for moral instruction among the destitute, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty as port warms his belly and fires crackle reassuringly nearby. The poor, he declares to murmured agreement, must learn the virtue of self-reliance and Christian resignation to their station in life. The irony drips like icicles from these words. Resignation spoken by men who've never known want. Self-reliance preached by those whose every comfort depends on others' labour. Meanwhile, in Whitechapel's narrow alleys, that same cold wind that merely ruffles Lord Hamilton's curtains becomes a howling destroyer, finding every gap in every wall, every hole in every shoe, every weakness in every shivering body. Here lives Timothy Walsh, a dock worker whose hands have become permanently shaped by cold and labour into claws that can barely straighten. Timothy hasn't felt truly warm in 3 months, hasn't had a full belly in 6 weeks, and hasn't slept without shivering in longer than he can remember. Yet Timothy possesses something Lord Hamilton lacks, an intimate understanding of human resilience that can only be forged in the crucible of genuine suffering. While politicians debate theoretical virtue, Timothy practices actual heroism every day, sharing his last crust with hungrier neighbours and checking on elderly Mrs. Fletcher down the hall, even when he can barely stand upright himself. The architecture of Victorian London wasn't just physical, it was moral, designed to ensure that wealth accumulated upward, while suffering pooled in the lowest places like toxic rain. Chapter 3, The Great Masquerade. Now observe how winter transforms London into a stage where the grandest performance of the century unfolds nightly, the elaborate masquerade of civilization. Behind every lit window, human dramas play out with Shakespearean intensity, though the audience rarely sees beyond their own personal theatre. At the Royal Opera House, Lady Pemberton adjusts her ermine stole while settling into her box to watch La Traviata. The tragic tale of Violetta's consumption moves her to delicate tears dabbed away with lace handkerchiefs. The irony remains invisible to her. She weeps for fictional suffering while real consumption claims dozens daily in the slums she never visits. The opera house itself becomes a microcosm of Victorian society. In the gilt boxes above, the wealthy display themselves like exotic birds, their jewels catching gaslight while servants hover with heated foot warmers and champagne. Below, in the cheaper galleries, clerks and shopkeepers crane their necks upward, trying to catch glimpses of both performance and aristocracy. But the real performance happens outside, where 12-year-old Annie Sullivan peddles programs to theatre-goers while her bare feet slowly freeze to the pavement. Annie has never seen an opera, never heard Verdi's music, never tasted champagne. Yet her performance, the daily heroics of staying alive in a city that considers her disposable, requires more courage than any staged drama. The wealthy audience files past Annie without seeing her, their minds already occupied with intermission gossip and post-theatre suppers. She might as well be invisible, another piece of street furniture that serves a function without deserving consideration. Inside the theatre, artificial tragedy unfolds with orchestral grandeur. Outside, real tragedy continues in silence, accompanied only by the wind and the distant sound of church bells tolling for the unnamed dead. Chapter 4, The Children's Crusade. Turn your attention now to the most heartbreaking performers in this winter spectacle. The children who were forced to grow old before they had finished being young. Their stories pierce the heart with sharp clarity. cutting through the fog of social pretense to reveal truths that adults preferred to ignore. In the grand nursery of the Pemberton mansion, young Master James plays with tin soldiers by a roaring fire, his greatest concern being whether to have jam or honey with his afternoon toast. Nanny reads him tales of adventure while hot milk warms his stomach and thick quilts await his bedtime. Meanwhile, 6-year-old Tommy O'Connor begins his workday at dawn, his small hands blue with cold as he sorts through refuse piles, searching for anything that might be sold. Tommy's education consists of learning which scraps of metal bring a halfpenny, which rags might be traded for bread, and how to stay invisible when the constables make their rounds. The contrast isn't just in their circumstances, it's in their very conception of childhood itself. Master James inhabits a world where children are treasured, protected, and prepared for future greatness. Tommy exists in a universe where children are simply smaller adults, expected to contribute to family survival from the moment they can walk. Watch little Sarah Fletcher, age 8, as she minds her infant brother while her mother takes in laundry. Sarah has never played with dolls. She's responsible for keeping a real baby alive in conditions that would challenge grown adults. Her thin arms struggle to rock the crying child while her own stomach cramps with hunger. Yet Sarah's love for her brother burns brighter than any fireplace flame. She sings him lullabies in a voice made hoarse by cold, creates toys from scraps of cloth and bits of string, and somehow finds ways to smile even when her world seems designed to crush smiles before they can fully form. These children weren't just victims of poverty, they were philosophers of endurance, teaching daily lessons in human dignity that their social superiors never learned despite their expensive educations. Chapter 5. The Invisible Army. Now let me reveal the secret that Victorian society desperately tried to hide, its complete dependence on an army of invisible workers whose suffering made possible every comfort the wealthy enjoyed. These weren't characters in a morality tale. They were the human engine that powered an empire while remaining unnamed and unremembered. Before dawn breaks over Mayfair, while Lady Pemberton still sleeps in silken comfort, an army mobilises in service to her lifestyle. Agnes Murphy, the scullery maid, rises at 4 to light the fires that will warm Lady Pemberton's bathwater. Agnes hasn't seen her own family in 2 years. They live in Ireland, and her wages barely cover food and lodging. Agnes performs miracles of logistics daily, coordinating coal deliveries, managing laundry schedules, and ensuring that wealth's complicated machinery runs smoothly. Her expertise in household management rivals any military general's understanding of supply lines, yet society considers her barely human, a necessary evil that enables proper people to live properly. In the stable behind the mansion, Daniel McKenna tends to horses worth more than most families earn in a decade. Daniel speaks to these animals with more gentleness than their owners show to human servants. The horses receive better food, warmer shelter, and more medical attention than the people who care for them. The coal that heats Lady Pemberton's breakfast room travels a chain of human suffering that stretches from Welsh mining villages to London delivery carts. Every lump of that coal is bought with human blood, extracted by men who descend into Earth's bowels knowing they might never return, carried by children whose lungs will never fully clear of dust. Yet Lady Pemberton worries about coal prices only when they affect her household budget, never questioning the human cost of the warmth she considers her natural right. Chapter 6. The Great Hunger. Food becomes the starkest divider in this tale of two cities, transforming nourishment itself into a weapon of class warfare. The same substance that sustains life becomes a marker of worth. a measure of humanity's value that varies with shocking precision according to social position. In the Pemberton dining room, Chef Morris prepares a breakfast that would feed a poor family for a week. Devilled kidneys, fresh eggs, buttered toast, marmalade imported from Scotland, cream thick enough to coat silver spoons. This abundance isn't unusual. It's daily routine, expected and unremarkable. Lady Pemberton examines the morning's offerings with critical eye, perhaps noting that the toast seems slightly too dark or the eggs not quite perfectly prepared. Her greatest food-related concern involves choosing between different varieties of expensive tea, while her cook plans an evening dinner for 12 that will feature 7 courses and wines from 3 different countries. 3 miles away, Mary O'Connor performs her own breakfast ritual, dividing a single slice of stale bread among 5 people, calculating how to make yesterday's soup bones yield 1 more day of thin broth. Mary hasn't tasted meat in 6 weeks, hasn't eaten her fill in 3 months, and hasn't fed her children adequately since autumn ended. Yet Mary approaches this mathematical impossibility with the determination of a field general, strategizing how to transform scarcity into sustenance through sheer force of will. She waters down milk until it becomes translucent, stretches porridge with whatever grain she can afford, and somehow finds ways to make her children believe they're not as hungry as they actually are. The cruelest irony reveals itself in the proximity of these 2 worlds. Lady Pemberton's kitchen produces enough food waste daily to feed the O'Connor family, yet this surplus disappears into refuse piles rather than hungry mouths. The system isn't just inefficient, it's designed to maintain scarcity as a tool of social control. Chapter 7, The Medicine Show. When illness strikes, and in winter, it strikes with relentless precision, the city reveals another layer of its elaborate hierarchy. Death itself becomes a luxury that some can afford to avoid, while others must embrace it as relief from suffering. Dr. Harrison Whitmore arrives at Lady Pemberton's mansion in a heated carriage, his leather medical bag filled with the latest pharmaceutical wonders imported from across Europe. His examination reveals nothing more serious than mild indigestion brought on by rich food, easily treated with rest, warm broths, and expensive tonics. Lady Pemberton recovers in a heated bedroom attended by nurses who monitor her every symptom. Her illness becomes an opportunity for dramatic performance, with friends calling to offer sympathy and servants hovering with whatever comfort she requires. Meanwhile, Dr. Whitmore's journey home takes him past St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where Dr. Emily Blackwell, one of London's few female physicians, battles medical catastrophes that would challenge any healer's skill. The charity ward overflows with victims of winter's warfare. Children with pneumonia, workers with frostbitten limbs, mothers dying of tuberculosis while their babies cry for milk they cannot provide. Dr. Blackwell works 18-hour days with primitive tools and inadequate supplies, performing surgeries by candlelight and treating dozens of patients with medicines that barely deserve the name. She saves lives through pure determination, applying knowledge gleaned from medical texts to situations those texts never contemplated. The contrast extends beyond individual treatment to systemic philosophy. Lady Pemberton's physician treats illness as unfortunate interruption to normal life, easily corrected with proper care and adequate resources. Dr. Blackwell treats illness as inevitable consequence of poverty, fighting symptoms while knowing their causes remain unchanged. In Victorian London, disease wasn't democratic. It followed the same social patterns as everything else, claiming the poor while sparing the rich with supernatural precision. Chapter 8. The Night Economy. When darkness falls over London, and in winter darkness falls early and stays late. The city transforms into a different creature entirely. The night reveals truths that daylight carefully conceals as desperation strips away pretense and survival becomes raw, honest, and terrible. While Lady Pemberton attends evening soirees in brilliantly lit ballrooms, 12-year-old Bobby Walsh navigates the fog-shrouded streets with a gang of children who've learned to make darkness their ally. Bobby leads expeditions into the wealthy districts where distracted gentlemen provide easy targets for quick fingers and quicker feet. Bobby doesn't think of himself as a criminal. He thinks of himself as a provider, using the only skills Winter has taught him to keep his siblings alive. His education consists of learning which pockets hold watches, which ladies carry purses, and how to disappear into fog before victims realize they've been robbed. The police, those brave men in blue who patrol with truncheons and shuttered lanterns, understand the mathematics of winter crime even when society refuses to acknowledge it. Constable William Patterson might arrest Bobby one night, but he also slips him a penny when the sergeant isn't watching, knowing that theft isn't moral failure but mathematical inevitability. In the gaslit theatres of the West End, a different kind of performance unfolds as society celebrates its own refinement. Ladies in silk gowns and gentlemen in evening dress applaud tragedies performed by professional actors, while real tragedies unfold just outside the theatre doors. The audience weeps at fictional suffering while remaining oblivious to actual suffering happening within sight of their carriages. They return home through streets where homeless families huddle in doorways, yet the theatrical tragedy they've witnessed seems more real to them than the human misery they step over. Chapter 9. The Women's War. Winter exposes another layer of Victorian society's elaborate cruelty, the way it transforms women into unwilling generals in humanity's daily battle for survival. Across all social classes, women bear responsibilities that men rarely acknowledge, yet their contributions remain invisible in official records. Lady Charlotte Pemberton wages her battles with calling cards and social invitations, orchestrating charitable events that display her virtue while maintaining proper distance from actual poverty. Her war involves managing servants, organising dinner parties, and ensuring that her household reflects appropriate status to maintain her family's social position. Charlotte genuinely believes her charity work serves important purpose, organising coal distributions and blanket drives that provide real relief to carefully selected deserving poor. Yet her charity reinforces the same system that creates poverty, offering temporary comfort while never questioning permanent solutions. Meanwhile, Mary O'Connor fights a different kind of war entirely, a daily battle against hunger, cold, and despair that requires strategies no military academy teaches. Mary transforms scraps into meals, rags into clothing, and desperation into hope through pure force of maternal determination. Mary's expertise in resource management surpasses any businessman's understanding of efficiency. She can stretch a penny into a pound's worth of value, turn refuse into resources, and create warmth from nothing but determination and love. Her skills represent centuries of accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of women who learned survival, because the alternative was death. Yet society values Charlotte's amateur charity work more than Mary's professional survival skills, considering one lady's hobby more important than another woman's life and death expertise. The ironies multiply when these worlds intersect. Charlotte's charitable visits to the deserving poor bring her face to face with women like Mary, yet she sees not equals but objects requiring assistance. Mary's strength, intelligence, and resourcefulness remain invisible to Charlotte, who perceives only neediness requiring charity, Chapter 10. The Children's Parliament. In the back streets and alleyways of Victorian London, children created their own government. A shadow parliament where survival skills were debated, territory was negotiated, and justice was administered according to rules adults never understood. These weren't just children playing at being grown-ups. They were adults trapped in children's bodies, forced to govern themselves because society had abandoned them. 11-year-old Lucy Fletcher presides over a confederation of street children who've banded together for protection and shared resources. Lucy's parliament meets in an abandoned warehouse, where they pool information about which streets offer the best pickings, which constables can be trusted, and which dangers require collective action. Lucy herself embodies contradictions that would challenge philosophers. She possesses the strategic thinking of a military commander, the negotiation skills of a diplomat, and the moral authority of a judge. Yet she's barely tall enough to reach most adults' shoulders, and still young enough that doll play should occupy her attention instead of life and death decision-making. The Children's Parliament operates on principles more just than those governing adult society. Food gets shared according to need rather than ability to pay. Protection gets offered to the weakest rather than the strongest. Information gets distributed freely rather than hoarded for advantage. When 8-year-old Danny Murphy arrives half-frozen and starving after losing his factory job, Lucy's parliament doesn't debate his worthiness or demand he prove deserving of help. They simply share what little they have because abandoning children to die alone violates their basic understanding of human decency. Yet these same children face daily harassment from adult authorities who consider their cooperation evidence of criminal conspiracy rather than remarkable social achievement. Police raids scatter their meetings, workhouse officials hunt them like criminals, and society treats their mutual aid as threat requiring suppression. The Children's Parliament reveals truths that adult governance carefully conceals, that human beings naturally cooperate when survival depends on it, that justice emerges from necessity rather than law, and that moral clarity often increases rather than decreases with desperation. Chapter 11. The Great Performance. Every Sunday, London stages its grandest performance, the weekly masquerade of Christian charity that allows the wealthy to feel virtuous while maintaining the very system that creates suffering they claim to address. Churches across the city become theatres where elaborate dramas of piety and poverty play out according to carefully scripted roles. At St. George's, Hanover Square, Lady Pemberton arrives in fur-lined glory to hear sermons about Christian duty delivered by clergy who've never experienced want. The collection plate grows heavy with coins donated by people whose annual charity budget represents less than they spend monthly on wine. Reverend Dr. Thornton speaks eloquently about accepting one's station in life with grace, finding comfort in promised heavenly rewards, and trusting divine providence to provide earthly necessities. His words carry particular authority since they're delivered from a heated pulpit to a heated congregation that returns to heated homes after services. The sermon's message becomes clear through repetition and emphasis. Poverty results from moral failing, wealth indicates divine favour, and questioning this arrangement challenges God himself. The theological framework provides perfect justification for maintaining earthly inequality by promising spiritual equality in some future existence. 3 miles eastward, at St. Bartholomew's Whitechapel, Father Michael O'Brien delivers different sermons to different circumstances. His congregation huddles together for warmth, while he speaks of endurance, hope, and the strength that emerges from suffering when suffering can't be avoided. Father O'Brien's theology emphasizes present reality rather than future promises, focusing on practical love demonstrated through shared resources rather than theoretical charity expressed through monetary donations. His church provides soup kitchens, temporary shelter, and actual assistance rather than spiritual comfort alone. Yet both sermons serve similar functions. They help their congregations accept circumstances that might otherwise seem unbearable, providing frameworks that make sense of senseless suffering or senseless privilege. The grand irony reveals itself when charitable donations from wealthy churches reach poor parishes, allowing Lady Pemberton's surplus to purchase coal for Mary O'Connor's family. This transaction enables charity without relationship, allowing wealth to feel virtuous without encountering poverty personally. Chapter 12. The Merchants of Hope. Winter creates its own economy of desperation where hope itself becomes commodity to be bought and sold by those who profit from human misery. This shadow marketplace thrives on the gap between desperate need and inadequate resources, with entrepreneurs specializing in the monetization of suffering. Dr. Mordecai Fitzwhistle arrives weekly at Whitechapel Market with a wagon painted in brilliant colors, advertising Professor Fitzwhistle's miracle winter elixir, cures consumption, frostbite, and the melancholy. His audience consists of people desperate enough to spend their last pennies on liquid hope, however false. The elixir contains mostly gin and sugar water with enough bitter herbs to suggest medical authority, but hope proves a powerful medicine even when hope is manufactured. Mothers dose consumptive children with Fitzwhistle's concoction, because doing something feels better than doing nothing, even when something accomplishes nothing. Meanwhile, legitimate merchants like Thomas Whitmore, the coal dealer, practice their own forms of profitable misery by raising prices precisely when demand peaks, and customers can least afford increases. Whitmore's business model depends on scarcity. Too much coal would drive down prices, while too little would drive away customers entirely. The mathematics of winter commerce reveal themselves clearly. Optimal profit comes from keeping people just desperate enough to pay premium prices, but not quite desperate enough to die before paying. This delicate balance requires sophisticated understanding of human psychology and economic necessity. Pawnbrokers like Solomon Roth perform similar calculations with family possessions, offering just enough money to prevent complete destitution, while ensuring that valuable items never get redeemed. Roth's shop fills with treasures sacrificed to winter's demands. Wedding rings traded for coal, family Bibles exchanged for bread, children's toys pawned to pay rent. These transactions strip away more than material possessions. They erode dignity, destroy family history, and transform relationships into commercial calculations. Yet people participate willingly, because alternatives involve watching children starve or freeze. Chapter 13. The Final Accounting. As winter grudgingly releases its grip on London, and spring begins its tentative approach, the city begins counting its annual harvest of human misery. Parish registers tell the story in stark numbers: deaths from exposure, pneumonia, malnutrition, and despair. Yet numbers never capture the full cost of a system designed to maintain privilege through organised suffering. Mary O'Connor survived that winter of 1847, but her youngest child did not. Little Michael, just 18 months old, succumbed to pneumonia in February, when medicines that might have saved him cost more than the family earned in a month. Mary grieved, but grief became luxury she couldn't afford with 4 other children still requiring her attention. Patrick O'Connor returned to dock work in spring with hands permanently damaged by frostbite. earning reduced wages for reduced capacity while supporting the same size family on smaller income. The mathematics of their existence became progressively impossible, yet somehow they continued existing. Lady Pemberton also experienced loss that winter. Her prize orchid collection died when the conservatory heating system failed during a January cold snap. She mourned those flowers for weeks and spent considerable money replacing them with even more exotic specimens imported from tropical regions. The accounting reveals winter's true cruelty. Some mourned children, others mourned flowers, yet society considered both losses equally newsworthy in their respective social circles. The death of a poor child warranted perhaps a line in parish records, while the death of a wealthy woman's orchids merited detailed newspaper coverage in society pages. Spring brought its own revelations about who had survived and how. Those who endured winter weren't necessarily the strongest, the smartest, or the most deserving. They were simply the luckiest, the most connected, or the most stubborn. Survival often depended on accidents of timing, location, and circumstance rather than character or effort. The children who lived emerged changed by experiences that no child should endure. Bobby Walsh grew 3 inches taller, but lost most of his teeth to malnutrition. Lucy Fletcher earned enough through various enterprises to save her younger siblings, but contracted diseases that would shorten her own life dramatically. These weren't happy endings. They were ongoing stories that continued into the next winter and the next, because in Victorian London, winter wasn't an annual visitor but a permanent resident, always lurking just months away in the cycle of seasons and suffering. Chapter 14. The Eternal Return. The spring of 1848 brought no fundamental changes to London's architecture of inequality, merely temporary relief from its most visible symptoms. The fog lifted, temperatures rose, and death rates decreased, allowing society to pretend that winter's horrors represented natural disasters rather than systemic failures. Parliament reconvened with renewed debates about poor law reform, public health initiatives, and moral instruction for the deserving poor. Lord Hamilton delivered speeches about the need for gradual improvement tempered by fiscal responsibility, while carefully avoiding mention of his own family's recent acquisition of a 4th country estate. The wealthy returned to their spring routines of garden parties and charity functions, their memories of winter already fading like morning mist. Lady Pemberton organised a benefit ball for orphan relief, raising enough money to fund a small orphanage for 6 months while spending twice that amount on ballroom decorations. Yet some changes occurred beneath society's surface, largely invisible to those who created the conditions requiring change. Dr. Emily Blackwell published papers describing winter's medical catastrophes, providing statistical evidence that poverty killed more efficiently than any epidemic. Her research would eventually contribute to public health reforms, though those reforms came decades too late for the children who died while evidence was being gathered. Father O'Brien expanded his church's soup kitchen and established a night shelter in the church basement, saving perhaps a dozen lives the following winter. His actions represented tiny improvements within a system that produced suffering faster than charity could address it. Yet those saved lives mattered absolutely to the people whose lives were saved. The Children's Parliament evolved into a more sophisticated network, developing better strategies for winter survival and mutual protection. Their innovations in cooperative economics and collective decision-making would eventually influence adult social movements, though the children themselves received no credit for their contributions to social progress. Most significantly, some people began asking different questions about winter's annual harvest of human misery. Instead of accepting poverty as natural law, a few reformers started examining the systems that created and maintained poverty. Their inquiries would eventually grow into movements that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Victorian society. Chapter 15. The Mirror's Reflection. As we emerge from this journey through Victorian London's winter of 1847, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that this story hasn't ended. It has simply changed costumes and learned better camouflage. The machinery that ground down Mary O'Connor and elevated Lady Pemberton continues operating in different forms across different cities, wearing modern faces but following ancient patterns. The fog that choked London's poor has lifted from those particular streets, but moral fog still obscures similar suffering in other places. The cold that killed children in Whitechapel has been replaced by different forms of systematic neglect that achieve identical results through more sophisticated methods. We live now in a world where technology could easily provide warmth, food, and shelter for every human being, yet children still die from preventable causes, while others live in unprecedented luxury. The tools for ending suffering exist. What remains missing is the collective will to use those tools for universal rather than exclusive benefit. The distance between Mary O'Connor and Lady Pemberton wasn't measured in miles, but in the vast expanse of a social system that treated human worth as a commodity determined by accident of birth. That same distance persists today, calculated now in different currencies but measuring identical moral failures. This story demands that we examine our own reflections in history's mirror. When contemporary poverty presents itself in our daily lives, do we respond like Lady Pemberton, with charitable gestures that maintain comfortable distance from systemic change? Or do we recognize that true compassion requires addressing causes rather than merely treating symptoms? The children who died in Victorian London didn't die of cold, disease, or hunger. They died of a society that valued property more than people, profit more than human dignity, order more than justice. Those same values continue operating in contemporary systems that produce similar results through more complex mechanisms. Every winter since 1847 has been a test of humanity's capacity to learn from its own history. The question isn't whether we remember Mary O'Connor's suffering, but whether we recognize her suffering in contemporary forms and commit ourselves to preventing its repetition. The fog has lifted from London streets, but the moral fog that created Victorian winter's horrors lingers in different forms, waiting for each generation to choose between perpetuating inherited systems or creating new ones based on principles of universal human dignity. Winter still comes to human civilization with mathematical precision, bringing cold that kills and creating scarcity that destroys. The only variables are our choices about who gets protected from winter's devastation and who gets abandoned to face it alone. The story of Victorian London's winter teaches us that suffering isn't inevitable, it's organised. The same intelligence that created systems to concentrate wealth and disperse misery could create systems to share resources and eliminate preventable suffering. The technology exists, the knowledge exists, only the collective will remains uncertain. As you return to your own warm spaces tonight, remember Mary O'Connor and her children. Remember that their story continues in different places with different names, but identical mathematics of exclusion and abandonment. Remember that every winter, somewhere in the world, parents are making impossible choices about which children to save when they cannot save them all. The winter is always coming. The question is whether we will choose to be Charlotte Pemberton, insulated from consequence by wealth and privilege, or the unnamed heroes who shared their last crust of bread with hungrier neighbours, who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable when alternatives existed. Their memory demands more than sympathy. It demands action. Not the comfortable charity that enables donors to feel virtuous while maintaining systems that create recipients, but the uncomfortable justice that requires examining our own positions within structures that benefit some by excluding others. The cold wind still blows through the streets of the world, seeking gaps in humanity's defences against suffering. The only question is whether we will finally choose to shelter each other from it, or whether we will continue huddling in our separate corners, pretending we don't hear the crying in the dark. This is what Victorian winter taught London, and what every winter since has taught every generation. Human dignity requires more than individual virtue. It requires collective commitment to building systems that treat every life as equally valuable, regardless of the circumstances of its birth or the accidents of its situation. The story ends where it began, with a choice. The winter is eternal, but our response to winter remains ours to determine. The question echoes across centuries. Who will we choose to be when the cold wind blows? Remember their names when you can. Remember their stories always. And remember that every winter since has been humanity's test. Are we learning from their suffering, or are we simply repeating it in new forms with different faces? The children are still crying in the dark. The question is whether we're finally ready to turn on the lights. Chapter 16. The Weight of Silence. In the months following that brutal winter of 1847, London developed a peculiar form of collective amnesia. The wealthy seemed incapable of remembering the suffering they had witnessed, while the poor learned to hide their scars beneath forced smiles and grateful deference. This orchestrated forgetting became as much a part of the city's social machinery as the coal that powered its factories or the Thames that carried its commerce. Lady Pemberton returned to her rounds of charity committees and social gatherings, speaking passionately about the need to help the deserving poor, while carefully avoiding any encounter with actual poverty that might disturb her carefully constructed worldview. Her drawing-room conversations sparkled with moral certainty, each speaker outdoing the others in demonstrations of virtue that cost nothing and changed nothing. The poor, she would declare with absolute confidence, must be taught the value of thrift and industry. Too much assistance merely encourages dependence. These words carried special authority because they came from someone who had never missed a meal, never felt genuine cold, never faced choices between rent and food, medicine and warmth. Her dinner guests nodded approvingly while servants circulated with imported delicacies worth more than most families earned in months. The irony remained invisible to everyone present. People discussing the moral hazards of assistance, while being waited upon by underpaid staff whose labour made their leisure possible. Meanwhile, Mary O'Connor carried her grief like a physical weight, feeling the absence of little Michael in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of consciousness. Yet she learned to smile when Lady Pemberton's charity visitors arrived with their carefully measured donations and their abundant advice about proper household management. "Thank you, ma'am," Mary would say with practiced humility, accepting blankets that smelled of lavender and mothballs from closets larger than her entire dwelling. "You're too kind, ma'am." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but gratitude was expected, and ungrateful poor people found their charity withdrawn with swift efficiency. Mary understood the rules of this elaborate theatre. She must be grateful but not demanding, needy but not desperate, deserving but not presumptuous. Her performance required perfect calibration. Too little misery, and she might not seem worthy of help. Too much, and she might make donors uncomfortable. The weight of this constant performance exhausted her almost as much as the physical demands of survival. She had to transform herself into a character acceptable to wealthy sensibilities, editing out any details that might challenge their comfortable assumptions about poverty's causes and solutions. Chapter 17. The Children's Education. As spring progressed into summer, London's children received different kinds of education depending on their social position. The wealthy children learned languages, literature, and arts designed to prepare them for lives of cultural refinement and social leadership. The poor children learned survival skills that no classroom could teach and no textbook could contain. Master James Pemberton spent his mornings with private tutors learning Latin grammar and Greek mythology, his afternoons with riding instructors and fencing masters developing aristocratic accomplishments. His education assumed a future of privilege and leisure, preparing him to inherit wealth and manage servants with casual authority. James learned to see poverty as natural law rather than policy choice, studying histories that explained social hierarchy as divine design rather than human creation. His textbooks described the poor as distinct species requiring different treatment, naturally suited to lives of labour and submission. Meanwhile, Bobby Walsh received his education in the streets and alleys of Whitechapel, learning skills that meant the difference between life and death. Bobby could identify police officers by their footsteps, estimate pocket contents by observing clothing quality, and navigate fog-shrouded streets by memory and instinct. His curriculum included practical mathematics, calculating odds on various crimes, determining optimal timing for different enterprises, managing limited resources across unpredictable time periods. These lessons required intelligence and precision that would challenge university students, yet society considered Bobby's education evidence of moral failure rather than intellectual achievement. Lucy Fletcher's education focused on leadership and diplomacy, as she coordinated activities among street children while avoiding adult authorities. Her responsibilities included negotiating territory agreements with rival groups, mediating disputes over scarce resources, and developing strategies for collective survival. Lucy possessed organisational skills that would qualify her for government positions if she had been born into different circumstances. Instead, her expertise remained invisible to society, which saw only criminal conspiracy where remarkable social cooperation actually existed. The educational divide wasn't just about access to schools or books, it was about fundamentally different conceptions of human potential. Wealthy children learned that they deserved leadership because of their superior breeding and moral character. Poor children learned that they deserved subordination because of their inherent limitations and moral defects. Yet the street children's actual achievements contradicted these lessons daily. Their innovations in cooperative economics, collective decision-making and resource management demonstrated capabilities that formal education claimed they lacked. Their survival required intelligence, creativity, and moral reasoning that wealthy children never needed to develop. Chapter 18. The Merchant's Paradise. Summer brought new opportunities for London's merchants to profit from human necessity, as the city's economic machinery adapted to extract maximum value from every form of suffering. The marketplace of misery expanded beyond winter's obvious needs to encompass subtler forms of exploitation that operated year-round. Housing became the summer equivalent of winter's coal shortage, with landlords like Jeremiah Crook specializing in properties that maximized rental income while minimizing maintenance costs. Crook's tenements housed dozens of families in buildings designed for single households, with rent calculated to consume every penny of available income. Crook understood that desperate people paid premium prices for substandard accommodations because alternatives didn't exist. His business model depended on maintaining housing scarcity while avoiding improvements that might reduce profit margins. Broken windows remained unrepaired, leaking roofs continued leaking, and sanitation systems failed regularly. Yet families like the O'Connors paid their rent religiously because eviction meant homelessness, and homelessness meant death when winter returned. Crook's psychological expertise rivaled any university professor's understanding of human behavior. He knew exactly how much misery people would endure to avoid slightly greater misery. The food marketplace operated on similar principles, with merchants like Samuel Whitmore specializing in goods just edible enough to sustain life, but never nutritious enough to provide genuine health. Whitmore's shop sold bread adulterated with alum and chalk, milk watered down and preserved with chalk and chemicals, and meat from animals that died of disease rather than slaughter. These products allowed poor families to feel like they were feeding their children, while actually providing substances that slowly poisoned them. Whitmore's customers knew his goods were inferior, but his prices remained the only ones they could afford, creating a captive market for products that wealthy consumers would reject immediately. The clothing trade followed identical patterns, with entrepreneurs like Moses Goldstein collecting cast-off garments from wealthy households and reselling them to poor families at prices that seemed reasonable, but actually exceeded the cost of new clothes. Goldstein's expertise involved calculating exactly how much desperate people would pay for threadbare coats and worn-out shoes. These merchants weren't evil individuals, but rational actors operating within a system that rewarded exploitation and punished compassion. Their success depended on understanding poverty's psychology better than social reformers understood it, then using that knowledge to extract profit from desperation. Chapter 19: The Invisible Machine. Behind London's visible economy of shops and markets operated an invisible machine of human trafficking that supplied wealthy households with the servants necessary to maintain their lifestyle. This machine operated with industrial efficiency, processing poor children through institutions designed to transform them into useful commodities. The Whitmore Foundation operated several training institutions where orphaned or abandoned children learned domestic service skills that would qualify them for positions in wealthy households. The foundation presented itself as a charitable organization rescuing children from streets and workhouses, providing them with education and opportunities for advancement. Yet the children's education consisted primarily of learning to remain invisible while performing essential tasks, to anticipate wealthy people's needs without expressing any of their own, and to accept minimal compensation for maximum labor with grateful humility. They were trained to become human furniture, functional, attractive, and utterly silent about their own experiences. 15-year-old Sarah Mitchell graduated from Whitmore Foundation, training to become lady's maid in the Pemberton household, where her duties included rising at 5 each morning to prepare Lady Pemberton's clothing, bath, and breakfast arrangements. Sarah worked 18-hour days for wages that barely covered her food and lodging. Yet Sarah considered herself fortunate because her position provided security and respectability that street children never achieved. Her training had taught her to value stability over dignity, safety over autonomy, survival over dreams. She learned to find satisfaction in serving others rather than developing her own capabilities. The machine's psychological components proved more sophisticated than its economic ones. Sarah genuinely believed that Lady Pemberton's happiness mattered more than her own, because society had taught her that wealthy people's comfort took precedence over poor people's well-being. This ideology wasn't imposed through force, but absorbed through constant repetition and reinforcement. Sarah received praise for selfless service and criticism for any hint of personal ambition, gradually internalizing the belief that her purpose in life involved enabling others to achieve their purposes. The foundation's success could be measured in the loyalty and dedication of its graduates, who served wealthy families with devotion that no amount of money could purchase. They had been psychologically programmed to find meaning in subordination, joy in sacrifice, and identity in service to their social superiors. Chapter 20. The Summer of Secrets. As 1847's summer progressed, London's streets revealed secrets that winter's fog had concealed. The season's warmth and longer daylight hours made poverty more visible, but also more bearable, creating temporary improvements that masked permanent problems, while allowing society to pretend that winter's horrors had been exaggerated. Street children like Bobby Walsh and Lucy Fletcher discovered new opportunities for survival as outdoor markets expanded and tourist traffic increased. Pickpocketing became easier when targets wore lighter clothing with more accessible pockets, while the abundance of street festivals and public gatherings provided cover for various enterprises. Yet summer also brought new dangers as increased police patrols and public attention made their activities riskier. The children adapted by developing more sophisticated strategies, creating lookout networks and communication systems that allowed them to avoid capture while maintaining their operations. Their innovations in collective security and resource sharing represented genuine advances in social organization. Yet authorities interpreted these developments as evidence of criminal conspiracy, requiring suppression rather than remarkable cooperation deserving study. Meanwhile, wealthy families like the Pembertons escaped to country estates where they could enjoy summer pleasures without encountering urban poverty. Their absence from London allowed them to maintain comfortable ignorance about conditions that their own lifestyle choices helped create and maintain. Lady Pemberton's letters from the countryside described idyllic scenes of rural beauty and honest peasant contentment, painting pictures of poverty that bore no resemblance to actual poverty, but perfectly suited her emotional needs for reassurance about social harmony. The simple country folk, she wrote to friends, seem so much happier than our restless urban poor. They accept their station with such graceful resignation, finding joy in simple pleasures that our spoiled city dwellers have forgotten. These observations revealed more about Lady Pemberton's psychological requirements than about rural realities. Her vision of happy peasants served the same function as her vision of deserving and undeserving poor. It provided moral justification for maintaining systems that concentrated wealth while dispersing suffering. If poor people were naturally content with poverty, then wealth concentration caused no harm and required no remedy. The summer's temporary improvements in urban conditions reinforced these comfortable illusions. Lower death rates and reduced visible suffering allowed wealthy observers to conclude that winter's problems had been solved through natural processes rather than systemic changes. Chapter 21. The Return of Winter. When autumn arrived in 1847, bringing the first warnings of winter's return, London's poor began their annual preparations for survival, while the wealthy made plans for social seasons that treated winter as entertainment rather than endurance test. The contrast between these preparations revealed the fundamental divide that separated two populations living in the same geographic space. Mary O'Connor started hoarding coal in September, buying single lumps whenever possible, and storing them in precious containers that protected against theft and dampness. Her calculations included estimating fuel needs against available income, determining which rooms could be heated and which must remain cold, and preparing children psychologically for months of discomfort. Mary's planning required expertise in resource management that would qualify her for positions in government or business, if her knowledge were recognized rather than dismissed. Her ability to transform scarcity into survival through careful calculation and innovative improvisation demonstrated intellectual capabilities that society refused to acknowledge. Meanwhile, Lady Pemberton planned her winter wardrobe and social calendar, consulting with dressmakers about the latest fashions and with household managers about entertaining schedules. Her concerns focused on maintaining appropriate appearances and social positions rather than survival itself. Lady Pemberton's preparations assumed abundance and security, requiring choices between different forms of luxury rather than calculations about bare necessities. Her biggest worries involved selecting appropriate gowns for various occasions and ensuring that her dinner parties reflected current social expectations. The children of both families faced autumn with different forms of anxiety. Master James anticipated return to lessons and social activities, looking forward to winter holidays and spring adventures. His future appeared predetermined and secure, requiring only that he accept privileges that came automatically with his birth circumstances. Little Tommy O'Connor faced autumn with terror that no child should experience, knowing that winter meant hunger, cold, and constant danger of death. His calculations included estimating which family members were most likely to survive if resources had to be allocated among competing needs. Yet Tommy also demonstrated resilience and creativity that privileged children never developed, finding ways to contribute to family survival through enterprises that required courage, intelligence, and determination that adult society refused to recognize as virtuous. Chapter 22. The Winter's Return. The winter of 1847-1848 brought familiar patterns of suffering and endurance, yet also subtle changes that reflected society's growing awareness of problems it remained unwilling to solve. Reform movements gained momentum while resistance to meaningful change grew more sophisticated, creating a complex dance between progress and reaction. Dr. Emily Blackwell expanded her documentation of poverty's medical consequences, producing statistical evidence that connected housing conditions directly to disease rates, malnutrition to infant mortality, and working conditions to life expectancy. Her research provided scientific justification for reforms that humanitarian arguments had failed to achieve, yet Dr. Blackwell's evidence encountered determined opposition from economic interests that profited from current conditions. Landlords like Jeremiah Crook argued that improved housing would increase costs and reduce availability, making poor families worse off rather than better off through unintended consequences. Factory owners claimed that better working conditions would force them to reduce employment, creating unemployment that would harm workers more than current conditions helped them. Coal merchants insisted that price regulations would create shortages that would leave poor families with no fuel rather than affordable fuel. These arguments possessed superficial plausibility that allowed opponents of reform to claim they were protecting poor people from well-intentioned policies that would actually harm them. The rhetoric of concern for unintended consequences became a sophisticated method of preventing intended improvements. Meanwhile, charitable organizations like the Whitmore Foundation developed more efficient methods of providing assistance that maintained dependency while avoiding changes that might reduce the need for charity. Their success in helping individual families served as evidence that systemic reform was unnecessary, because private charity could address all legitimate needs. The Foundation's approach appealed to wealthy donors because it allowed them to feel virtuous while maintaining comfortable distance from structural changes that might affect their own privileges. Charity became a method of preventing justice rather than achieving it. Chapter 23: The Children's Revolution. During that second winter, the street children of London achieved something unprecedented in the city's history. They created a functioning alternative society that operated according to principles of mutual aid and collective responsibility, rather than individual competition and hierarchical authority. Lucy Fletcher's leadership had evolved into something resembling democratic governance, with decisions made through discussions that included all affected parties rather than commands issued by single authorities. The Children's Parliament had developed procedures for debate, voting, and implementation that ensured everyone's voice was heard and everyone's needs were considered. Their economic system redistributed resources according to need rather than accumulating wealth in individual hands, creating security for all members rather than luxury for successful few. Food, shelter, and protection were shared equally, with those who earned more contributing more and those who earned less receiving proportional support. The children's justice system emphasized rehabilitation over punishment, addressing harmful behavior through education and community service, rather than exclusion and retribution. When conflicts arose, they were resolved through mediation and reconciliation, rather than violence and dominance. Yet this remarkable social experiment remained invisible to adult authorities, who saw only criminal conspiracy where genuine social innovation was actually occurring. Police raids continued disrupting their meetings, workhouse officials continued hunting them like criminals, and society continued treating their cooperation as evidence of moral corruption rather than social achievement. Bobby Walsh had become something like a minister of external affairs, managing relationships with adult society while protecting the children's internal autonomy. His diplomatic skills included knowing which police officers could be trusted, which merchants would trade fairly, and which adults might provide assistance without demanding submission in return. The children's success in creating functional community based on justice and mutual support contrasted sharply with adult society's failures to address basic human needs through existing institutions. Their achievements demonstrated that cooperation was more effective than competition for solving collective problems. Chapter 24: The Great Contradiction. By spring of 1848, London embodied a contradiction that would define the Victorian era. Unprecedented wealth alongside persistent poverty, remarkable technological achievements alongside primitive social organisation, elaborate moral rhetoric alongside systematic cruelty. The city's industrial capacity could produce enough goods to meet everyone's basic needs. Yet those goods were distributed according to market mechanisms that ensured abundance for few and scarcity for many. The same society that built railways spanning continents couldn't provide adequate housing for its own children. Parliamentary debates about social reform revealed the intellectual bankruptcy of a system that could analyze problems with scientific precision while remaining incapable of implementing obvious solutions. Politicians discussed poor law reform with expertise that demonstrated complete understanding of poverty's causes, while proposing remedies that addressed symptoms rather than sources. Lord Hamilton delivered speeches acknowledging that current conditions were regrettably harsh, while explaining why proposed improvements were economically impossible and socially dangerous. His rhetoric combined humanitarian concern with practical objections in ways that made inaction seem both inevitable and virtuous. The fundamental contradiction lay in society's simultaneous claim to Christian morality and capitalist efficiency, as if economic systems that concentrated wealth were compatible with religious teachings about universal brotherhood. This cognitive dissonance required elaborate mental gymnastics that transformed selfishness into virtue and injustice into natural law. Churches preached sermons about loving thy neighbour, while blessing economic arrangements that ensured neighbours would live in conditions that made love difficult and survival uncertain. The same clergy who spoke eloquently about spiritual equality maintained social systems based on fundamental inequality. Wealthy families attended services where they heard lessons about helping the less fortunate, then returned to homes maintained by servants whose wages kept them among the less fortunate. The charity they practiced allowed them to feel virtuous while maintaining the very conditions that created the need for charity. Chapter 25. The Reckoning Deferred. As our journey through Victorian London's winter of suffering draws toward its close, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that the reckoning never came. The poor continued suffering, the wealthy continued prospering, and society continued pretending that this arrangement reflected natural law rather than political choice. Mary O'Connor survived that second winter, but barely. Her family had been reduced by death and dispersion. Little Michael dead of pneumonia, teenage daughter Bridget sent into domestic service, elderly mother-in-law claimed by consumption. The survivors huddled together in the same miserable room, carrying on because the alternative was surrender. Patrick O'Connor's damaged hands limited his earning capacity, forcing the family deeper into debt to landlords and moneylenders who calculated interest rates based on desperation rather than ability to pay. Their situation deteriorated steadily despite their best efforts, demonstrating that individual virtue and determination couldn't overcome systemic obstacles. Yet Mary refused to surrender her dignity to circumstances that demanded surrender. She continued caring for her remaining children with fierce love that transformed deprivation into devotion, teaching them through her example that human worth wasn't determined by economic circumstances. Meanwhile, Lady Pemberton's lifestyle continued unchanged except for slight increases in her charitable contributions, which allowed her to feel increasingly virtuous about her response to social problems. Her donations funded larger coal distributions and expanded soup kitchens, while the conditions that created the need for such assistance remained unaltered. The Pemberton family acquired additional properties and investments during this period, increasing their wealth while poverty deepened around them. Their prosperity seemed to confirm their beliefs about moral superiority and divine favour, providing evidence that the system rewarded virtue and punished vice. Master James Pemberton grew into young manhood with complete confidence in his natural right to command others and expect service from social inferiors. His education had prepared him to inherit privilege without question, to exercise authority without doubt, and to benefit from others' labour without guilt. Chapter 26. The Eternal Lesson. The winter of 1847-1848 in Victorian London teaches us that societies choose their moral priorities through the policies they implement and the conditions they tolerate. Every social arrangement reflects values, whether those values are explicitly acknowledged or unconsciously absorbed through cultural transmission. London's elaborate architecture of inequality wasn't an accident or a temporary problem. It was the intended result of choices made by people with power to make different choices. The suffering we've witnessed wasn't natural disaster, but organized catastrophe, designed and maintained by human decisions that could have been made differently. The fog that choked London's poor wasn't just meteorological phenomenon, but visible manifestation of a society that poisoned its own atmosphere through industrial processes that prioritized profit over human health. The cold that killed children wasn't just weather, but social climate that treated some lives as valuable and others as expendable. Yet within this horror, we've also witnessed examples of human dignity that shine brighter for being surrounded by darkness. Mary O'Connor's fierce love for her children, the street children's remarkable cooperation, Dr. Blackwell's dedication to healing, Father O'Brien's practical Christianity. These examples prove that moral beauty can flourish even in moral deserts. The children who survived London's winter learned lessons about resilience, community, and justice that their privileged contemporaries never mastered despite expensive educations. Their knowledge about cooperation and mutual aid represented advances in social organization that society refused to recognize as achievements. Their story reminds us that human beings naturally cooperate when survival depends on cooperation, naturally share when sharing increases everyone's security, and naturally care for each other when caring is allowed to flourish rather than suppressed as weakness. The distance between Mary O'Connor and Lady Pemberton wasn't created by natural law or divine providence. It was created and maintained by human institutions that could be reformed or replaced if enough people chose to reform or replace them. Every winter since 1847 has tested humanity's commitment to learning from its own history. The tools for ending preventable suffering have improved dramatically, yet preventable suffering continues because the will to use those tools universally rather than selectively remains uncertain. Chapter 27. The Mirror's Warning. As we return to our own time, carrying the memory of Victorian London's winter deep in our consciousness, we must examine our own reflections in history's unforgiving mirror. The question isn't whether we remember Mary O'Connor's suffering, but whether we recognize her suffering in contemporary forms and commit ourselves to preventing its repetition. The machinery that created Victorian London's architecture of inequality continues operating in modified forms across the modern world. Different technologies, different vocabularies, different justifications, but identical mathematical results. Concentration of wealth, dispersion of suffering, organized scarcity amid potential abundance. Children still die from preventable causes while others enjoy unprecedented luxury. Families still face impossible choices between necessities, while others accumulate possessions beyond any conceivable need. Communities still lack basic services while others enjoy amenities that previous generations couldn't imagine. The fog has lifted from London streets, but moral fog still obscures similar suffering in different places. We've learned to hide poverty more efficiently, to isolate suffering more completely, to disguise inequality more sophisticatedly, but we haven't learned to eliminate the conditions that create these problems. Our contemporary charity resembles Lady Pemberton's charitable activities more than we care to admit. Well-intentioned efforts that provide temporary relief while avoiding structural changes that might reduce the need for charity. We've become expert at treating symptoms while ignoring causes, at managing problems while avoiding solutions. The street children's achievements in cooperative economics and democratic governance remain relevant to contemporary challenges, yet their innovations receive no recognition in histories written by winners rather than survivors. Their knowledge about community building and collective security could inform current social policies if we were willing to learn from sources society prefers to ignore. The contradiction that defined Victorian London, unprecedented productive capacity alongside persistent human misery, defines our current moment even more dramatically. We possess technologies that could easily provide basic necessities for every human being. Yet scarcity continues because abundance would disrupt economic systems based on artificial scarcity. Chapter 28. The Choice Eternal. This story ends where it began, with a choice that each generation must make anew. Will we choose to perpetuate inherited systems that concentrate benefits while dispersing costs? Or will we choose to create new systems based on principles of universal human dignity and shared responsibility? The winter is always coming, in different forms and different places, but with identical requirements for human cooperation in the face of natural challenges. Climate change, economic inequality, political instability, social fragmentation. These contemporary winters demand the same qualities that allowed some Victorians to survive while others perished. Mary O'Connor's fierce love for her children, the street children's innovative cooperation, Dr. Blackwell's scientific dedication, Father O'Brien's practical compassion. These examples provide templates for contemporary responses to contemporary challenges. Their memory demands more than sympathy or admiration, it demands action. Not the comfortable charity that enables donors to feel virtuous while maintaining systems that create recipients, but the uncomfortable justice that requires examining our own positions within structures that benefit some by excluding others. The children are still crying in the dark, in different places with different voices, but with identical needs for warmth, food, shelter, and the simple recognition that their lives matter as much as any other lives. The question echoes across centuries. Who will we choose to be when we hear that crying? Will we be Lady Pemberton, wrapped in comfortable explanations about why suffering is inevitable and charity is sufficient? Or will we be the unnamed heroes who shared their last crust of bread, who refused to accept that children should die when alternatives existed, who built communities based on mutual aid rather than mutual exploitation? The fog has lifted from London streets, but the moral fog that created Victorian winter's horrors lingers in contemporary forms, waiting for each generation to choose between inherited systems and alternative possibilities. The technology exists to eliminate preventable suffering. The knowledge exists to organize societies based on justice rather than domination. Only the collective will remains uncertain. Every winter since 1847 has been humanity's test. Are we learning from their suffering, or are we simply repeating it in new forms with different faces? The cold wind still blows through the streets of the world, seeking gaps in humanity's defences against unnecessary suffering. The only question is whether we will finally choose to shelter each other from it, or whether we will continue huddling in our separate corners, pretending we don't hear the crying in the dark. Remember their names when you can. Remember their stories always. And remember that every winter since has been our test. Will we finally turn on the lights, or will we continue pretending that darkness is natural and inevitable? The children are still crying, the choice remains ours. Chapter 29. The Weight of Memory. Years passed like seasons of suffering punctuated by brief respites, each winter bringing fresh casualties, while summers provided temporary amnesia for those privileged enough to forget. The patterns established in 1847 hardened into institutional traditions that would define Victorian society for generations. creating a legacy of organised indifference that outlasted the individuals who created it. Mary O'Connor aged rapidly under the accumulated weight of loss and struggle, each winter carving deeper lines into her face while strengthening her resolve to protect her surviving children. By 1850, she had become a walking chronicle of poverty's physical and emotional toll, yet also a testament to human endurance that impressed even the charity visitors who came to measure her deservingness. Her remaining children learned survival skills that no school curriculum taught, developing expertise in resource management, risk assessment, and community building that would serve them throughout their lives. They learned to find dignity in circumstances designed to destroy dignity, to maintain hope when hope seemed ridiculous, to care for others when they barely had enough to care for themselves. Patrick O'Connor's hands never fully recovered from the frostbite damage of 1847, leaving him permanently disabled and increasingly dependent on employment that required strength he no longer possessed. His wages declined steadily, while his family's needs remained constant, creating an impossible mathematics that could only be solved through borrowing that deepened their dependency. Yet Patrick refused to surrender his role as family protector, finding ways to contribute to household survival through activities that didn't require manual dexterity. He became expert in negotiating with landlords, managing relationships with creditors, and navigating the bureaucratic maze of poor relief systems that seemed designed to humiliate applicants more than help them. Meanwhile, Lady Pemberton's charity work evolved into something approaching professional philanthropy, with committees, annual reports, and social events that raised substantial funds for carefully selected causes. Her reputation for compassionate concern grew throughout London society, earning her recognition as a model of Christian virtue and social responsibility. Lady Pemberton's approach to charity became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating new theories about scientific philanthropy that promised to address root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. Yet her solutions invariably focused on changing poor people's behaviour rather than changing the conditions that created poverty. Her charitable philosophy emphasized moral education, thrift instruction, and character development, approaches that assumed poverty resulted from personal failings rather than systemic problems. This focus allowed her to feel progressive while avoiding any challenge to the fundamental arrangements that maintained her own privilege. The Pemberton mansion became a salon for reform-minded aristocrats who discussed social improvement over wine and delicacies worth more than poor families earned annually. Their conversations sparkled with moral fervour and intellectual sophistication, yet somehow never reached conclusions that might require personal sacrifice from the discussants. Chapter 30. The Education of Suffering. By 1851, London's street children had developed educational systems more sophisticated than anything offered in formal schools, creating curricula based on practical necessity rather than theoretical knowledge. Their learning encompassed skills that prepared them for actual survival rather than imaginary futures that would never materialize. Lucy Fletcher had evolved into something resembling a professor of social organization, teaching younger children how to create and maintain communities based on mutual support rather than hierarchical domination. Her lessons covered conflict resolution, resource distribution, collective decision-making, and leadership rotation, subjects that university curricula wouldn't acknowledge for decades. The children's school operated without buildings, books, or official recognition, yet produced graduates with practical intelligence that surpassed formally educated contemporaries in many areas. Their knowledge about human psychology, economic cooperation, and social innovation came from direct experience rather than abstract theory. Bobby Walsh specialized in what might be called diplomatic studies, developing expertise in cross-cultural communication that allowed him to navigate between the children's community and adult society. His skills included language adaptation, behavioral modification, and strategic presentation, abilities that qualified him for government service if his background hadn't disqualified him automatically. Their educational achievements remained invisible to society because they occurred outside approved institutions and focused on knowledge that challenged approved ideologies. The children learned that cooperation was more effective than competition, that sharing increased everyone's security, and that democratic decision-making produced better results than authoritarian command. These lessons contradicted everything that formal education taught about natural human behavior, economic necessity, and social organization. Adult society couldn't acknowledge the children's achievements without questioning its own assumptions about human nature and social possibility. Meanwhile, Master James Pemberton's formal education continued preparing him for leadership roles that assumed his natural superiority and inherited right to command others. His curriculum included classical languages, mathematical sciences, and historical studies that reinforced his belief in hierarchical social organization and aristocratic privilege. James learned to see poverty as evidence of moral failure, inequality as reflection of natural law, and his own advantages as rewards for superior character rather than accidents of birth. His education was designed to produce confident leaders rather than thoughtful citizens, decisive commanders rather than collaborative partners. The contrast between these educational approaches revealed competing visions of human possibility, one based on cooperation and mutual development, the other based on domination and individual advancement. The street children's experiments in democratic education threatened the foundations of a system based on predetermined hierarchy. Chapter 31. The Merchants of Misery. As Victorian London's economy matured, entrepreneurs discovered increasingly sophisticated methods of extracting profit from human suffering, creating markets that thrived on maintaining scarcity amid potential abundance. These merchants of misery developed business models that required permanent poverty to ensure permanent profitability. Jeremiah Crook expanded his housing empire through strategic acquisition of properties in poor districts, gradually concentrating ownership while systematically degrading building conditions to maximize rental income. His business plan required maintaining housing shortage to keep rents high, while avoiding improvements that might reduce profit margins. Crook's success depended on understanding desperation psychology better than his tenants understood it themselves, calculating exactly how much misery people would endure before seeking alternatives that didn't exist. His properties offered just enough shelter to prevent death while never providing enough comfort to enable dignity. The food industry developed parallel strategies through entrepreneurs like Samuel Whitmore, who specialized in products that provided minimal nutrition at maximum prices. Whitmore's empire included bakeries that produced bread adulterated with alum and chalk, dairies that sold milk diluted with water and preserved with borax, and butcher shops that sold meat from diseased animals. These products allowed poor families to believe they were feeding their children, while actually providing substances that slowly undermined health and development. Whitmore's psychological expertise included understanding how hunger affected decision-making, making desperate people willing to purchase food they knew was harmful. The clothing trade followed similar patterns through merchants like Moses Goldstein, who created complex networks for collecting, processing, and reselling used garments, at prices that often exceeded the cost of new clothes. Goldstein's success required maintaining artificial scarcity in the used clothing market while presenting inferior goods as bargains. His business model included understanding fashion psychology among poor customers who sought respectability through clothing that provided the appearance of social acceptability without the substance of actual social acceptance. Goldstein sold hope disguised as haberdashery, dignity packaged as bargain merchandise. These merchants weren't individually evil, but collectively created systems that required human suffering to generate profit. Their success demonstrated that capitalism could transform any human need into market opportunity, including the need for basic survival requirements that should have been social guarantees. The market economy's genius lay in its ability to make exploitation seem like mutual benefit, convincing both exploiters and exploited that their relationship served everyone's interests. Customers felt grateful for opportunities to purchase overpriced inferior goods because alternatives were even worse or completely unavailable. Chapter 32. The Architecture of Forgetting. Victorian London developed elaborate cultural mechanisms for rendering poverty invisible to those whose comfort depended on maintaining the conditions that created poverty. This architecture of forgetting operated through physical separation, psychological rationalization, and social ritual that allowed the wealthy to avoid confronting the consequences of their privilege. Urban planning itself became a tool for segregating misery from comfort, creating geographical buffers that ensured wealthy neighborhoods remained insulated from poor districts. The city's street layout channeled poor people's movement through routes that minimized their visibility to wealthy residents, while public transportation systems provided separate facilities that maintained class distinctions. Parks, theatres, shops, and restaurants developed informal but effective exclusion mechanisms that kept poor people out without explicitly prohibiting their presence. Dress codes, pricing structures, and social expectations created barriers more effective than legal restrictions while allowing establishments to maintain their democratic pretensions. The wealthy developed sophisticated vocabularies for discussing poverty that transformed systemic problems into individual failings, economic arrangements into natural laws, and policy choices into inevitable necessities. This linguistic transformation made inequality seem morally neutral rather than morally problematic. Terms like deserving poor and undeserving poor allowed charitable donors to feel virtuous while maintaining judgment about who merited assistance, effectively dividing poor people against each other, while avoiding questions about why anyone should need charity in a prosperous society. Religious institutions provided theological justifications for economic arrangements that concentrated wealth while dispersing suffering, teaching that poverty reflected divine will rather than human choice, that inequality served spiritual purposes rather than material interests, and that charity was virtue rather than justice. These religious teachings allowed wealthy believers to feel morally superior while maintaining economic systems that created the conditions requiring charitable intervention. Faith became a method of avoiding rather than achieving social justice. Prayer became substitute for action, and spiritual equality became excuse for material inequality. The press developed reporting conventions that presented poverty as individual tragedy rather than systemic failure, focusing on exceptional cases that inspired sympathy while avoiding analysis that might inspire action. Newspapers published heartwarming stories about charitable giving while ignoring uncomfortable questions about why charity was necessary. This journalistic approach encouraged readers to feel emotional responses that didn't require political responses, allowing them to experience sympathy without responsibility, concern without commitment, awareness without action. Chapter 33. The Children's Wisdom. Despite society's efforts to suppress their innovations, London's street children continued developing social technologies that demonstrated alternatives to hierarchical organisation and competitive economics. Their experiments in cooperative living and democratic governance produced results that contradicted every assumption about human nature that formal institutions promoted. By 1852, Lucy Fletcher's leadership had evolved into something resembling rotating chairmanship, with different children taking responsibility for coordination, while major decisions remained collective. This system prevented power concentration while ensuring effective leadership, creating stability without authoritarianism. Their economic arrangements had developed sophisticated mechanisms for sharing resources according to need, while rewarding contribution according to ability, creating security for all members while encouraging individual excellence. No child went hungry while others had plenty. Yet those who earned more contributed more without resentment or resistance. The children's conflict resolution procedures emphasized restoration over punishment, focusing on healing relationships and preventing future problems rather than imposing penalties for past mistakes. When disputes arose, they were addressed through mediation and education rather than exclusion and domination. Their justice system operated on principles that adult courts claimed to follow but rarely achieved: equal treatment regardless of personal characteristics, proportional responses to actual harm, and rehabilitation rather than retribution as the goal of intervention. Bobby Walsh had become expert in what modern theorists would call conflict transformation, helping disputants understand underlying causes of disagreement, while developing solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate interests. His mediation skills surpassed those of professional lawyers who specialized in winning rather than solving. The children's educational methods emphasize collaborative learning over competitive achievement, practical knowledge over abstract theory, and character development over information accumulation. Their teaching focused on developing capabilities that served community needs rather than individual advancement. Their innovations in democratic decision-making included procedures for ensuring that every voice was heard, every perspective was considered, and every person affected by decisions participated in making them. They developed methods for reaching consensus without coercion, managing disagreement without division. Yet these remarkable achievements remained invisible to adult authorities, who saw only criminal conspiracy where genuine social innovation was occurring. The children's success in creating functional alternatives to dysfunctional systems threatened the ideological foundations of Victorian society. Their existence proved that cooperation was more natural than competition, that sharing increased rather than decreased prosperity, that democratic organization was more effective than authoritarian control, and that human beings naturally cared for each other when social systems allowed caring to flourish. Chapter 34. The Great Exhibition. The year 1851 brought London's Great Exhibition, a celebration of industrial progress and British achievement that showcased technological marvels while carefully hiding the human costs of technological development. The Crystal Palace became a monument to selective vision, displaying products while concealing production conditions. Visitors from around the world marveled at machines that could manufacture goods with unprecedented efficiency. Yet the exhibition included no displays about the workers who operated those machines under conditions that destroyed health and shortened lives. Technology appeared as pure progress rather than mixed blessing with differential costs and benefits. Lady Pemberton attended the exhibition multiple times, bringing friends and family to witness British industrial supremacy while discussing the moral implications of technological advancement. Her conversations revealed sophisticated understanding of machinery and manufacturing processes, yet complete ignorance about working conditions in the factories that produced exhibited goods. The exhibition celebrated steam engines, textile machinery, and precision instruments as triumphs of human ingenuity, which they certainly were. Yet these same technologies enabled production systems that required child labour, dangerous working conditions, and wages insufficient to support family survival. Meanwhile, street children like Bobby Walsh and Lucy Fletcher found the exhibition grounds fertile territory for various enterprises, as crowds of distracted visitors provided opportunities for resourceful young people willing to take calculated risks. Their presence at this celebration of progress created uncomfortable juxtapositions between technological achievement and social failure. The children moved through exhibitions of industrial machinery like living reminders of industrialization's human costs, their thin faces and patched clothing contrasting sharply with gleaming displays of mechanical precision and productive capacity. Security forces worked diligently to remove these visual contradictions from exhibition grounds, maintaining the fiction that technological progress automatically meant social progress, that increased productive capacity automatically meant improved living conditions for everyone. The exhibition's organisers understood that allowing poor children to remain visible among displays of prosperity would raise questions about why increased wealth hadn't eliminated poverty, why greater productive capacity hadn't ensured basic necessities for all citizens. Foreign visitors left the exhibition impressed by British technological leadership, while remaining ignorant about British social conditions, carrying home reports of industrial advancement that omitted mention of the human machinery that made mechanical machinery possible. The Great Exhibition thus became a perfect metaphor for Victorian society itself, a glittering display of achievement that depended on hiding the suffering required to produce such achievement, a celebration of progress that required forgetting about those who hadn't progressed. Chapter 35. The Mathematics of Suffering. By the early 1850s, social reformers had begun developing statistical methods for measuring poverty's extent and impact, creating mathematical documentation of suffering that society preferred to ignore. These early social scientists produced evidence that challenged comfortable assumptions about poverty's causes while suggesting solutions that threatened comfortable arrangements. Dr. Emily Blackwell's medical research had evolved into comprehensive studies of disease patterns that revealed direct correlations between housing conditions and health outcomes, nutrition levels and infant mortality, working conditions and life expectancy. Her data demonstrated that poverty killed more efficiently than any epidemic. Dr. Blackwell's statistics showed that children in wealthy districts lived, on average, 3 times longer than children in poor districts, that women in comfortable circumstances survived childbirth at rates dramatically higher than women in desperate circumstances, and that working-class men died decades earlier than leisure-class men. Her research proved that these differences weren't natural variations but systematic results of systematic causes: inadequate housing, insufficient nutrition, dangerous working conditions, and limited access to medical care. The statistics revealed that poverty was deadlier than cholera, more destructive than warfare, more devastating than natural disaster. Yet Dr. Blackwell's evidence encountered determined resistance from interests that profited from conditions her research documented. Factory owners questioned her methodology, landlords challenged her conclusions, and politicians dismissed her recommendations as economically impossible despite their moral appeal. The mathematical precision of her documentation made it difficult to deny poverty's effects, while the mathematical complexity of her analysis made it easy to avoid addressing poverty's causes. Statistics could prove that poor people died younger without requiring anyone to change the conditions that killed them. Government committees studied Dr. Blackwell's research with great thoroughness, producing reports that acknowledged problems while explaining why solutions remained impractical. Their analysis demonstrated sophisticated understanding of statistical evidence combined with remarkable creativity in avoiding policy implications. Meanwhile, entrepreneurs like Jeremiah Crook developed their own statistical analyses focused on maximizing rental income while minimizing maintenance costs, calculating optimal levels of overcrowding and deterioration that would generate profits without triggering government intervention. These competing mathematical approaches revealed different priorities. Dr. Blackwell's research aimed to reduce human suffering, while Crook's research aimed to increase business profits. Yet both used similar methodological approaches to reach opposite conclusions about optimal social arrangements. The availability of statistical evidence didn't automatically produce policy changes because statistics themselves were neutral tools that could serve different purposes, depending on who controlled their interpretation and application. Chapter 36: The Persistence of Hope. Despite accumulating evidence about systemic causes of suffering, individual families like the O'Connors continued their daily struggles with determination that transcended rational calculation. Their persistence reflected more than mere stubbornness. It demonstrated faith in human possibility that couldn't be defeated by statistical evidence or economic logic. Mary O'Connor's remaining children had grown into young adults who carried their family's values into a world that seemed designed to crush such values. They had learned to find dignity in circumstances that denied dignity, to maintain hope when hope seemed irrational, to care for others when caring received no reward. Her daughter Bridget had completed her domestic service training and secured employment in a respectable household, where her wages barely covered her own needs while allowing her to send occasional small amounts home to help support younger siblings. Bridget's sacrifice enabled the family's survival while limiting her own possibilities for advancement or independence. Her son Patrick Jr. had found work as a messenger, running errands throughout London's commercial districts while developing intimate knowledge of the city's economic geography. His job provided a regular income that fluctuated with business cycles, requiring careful budgeting and constant anxiety about future employment. The youngest son, Tommy, had joined the ranks of London's street vendors, selling newspapers and small goods, while avoiding the attention of authorities who considered such activities evidence of criminal tendencies rather than entrepreneurial initiative. Tommy's success required intelligence and determination that would qualify him for much better positions if his background hadn't disqualified him automatically. Each family member contributed to collective survival while pursuing individual dreams that seemed increasingly unrealistic as they aged into full awareness of their social position. Yet they refused to surrender their aspirations entirely, maintaining hope as an act of rebellion against circumstances designed to crush hope. Patrick Sr. had developed expertise in navigating government assistance programs, understanding which officials could be trusted, which forms needed completion, and which arguments might persuade bureaucrats to provide help rather than hindrance. His knowledge about social services exceeded that of many professional social workers. The family's persistence created ripple effects throughout their community. as their example inspired other families to continue struggling rather than surrender to despair. Their refusal to accept defeat made defeat less likely for their neighbours, creating collective resilience that individual determination alone couldn't achieve. Yet their heroic endurance also served the interests of those who profited from maintaining conditions that required such heroism, allowing society to celebrate individual virtue while avoiding systemic change that might reduce the need for virtue. Chapter 37. The Evolution of Charity. Victorian London's charitable institutions had evolved by the mid-1850s into complex organisations that provided significant assistance while maintaining the social arrangements that created the need for assistance. This evolution reflected genuine concern for human suffering combined with unconscious investment in preserving systems that produced predictable amounts of suffering, requiring charitable intervention. The Whitmore Foundation had expanded its operations to include multiple training institutions, employment placement services, and temporary housing facilities that served thousands of poor families annually. Lady Pemberton served on its board of directors, bringing her social connections and fundraising expertise to bear on increasingly sophisticated relief efforts. The Foundation's approach emphasized moral education alongside material assistance, requiring beneficiaries to demonstrate proper attitudes and behaviors before receiving help. This requirement reflected genuine belief that poverty resulted partly from character defects that could be corrected through appropriate instruction and example. Yet the Foundation's success in helping individual families served as evidence that poverty could be addressed through private charity rather than public policy, reducing pressure for systematic changes that might eliminate the conditions creating the need for charity. Charitable organizations competed with each other for donations and recognition, developing marketing strategies that emphasized their effectiveness while highlighting the failures of government programs. This competition encouraged innovation in service delivery while discouraging cooperation that might be more effective for clients. The charity industry created employment for middle-class administrators and social workers who developed professional interests in maintaining problems they were hired to solve. Their expertise in managing poverty made them stakeholders in poverty's persistence rather than advocates for poverty's elimination. Religious charities emphasize spiritual transformation alongside material relief, requiring attendance at services and participation in moral instruction as conditions for receiving assistance. These requirements reflected sincere belief that spiritual health was more important than physical health. Yet they also ensured that charitable assistance reinforced existing power relationships. Secular charities focused on scientific philanthropy that promised to address root causes through careful study and systematic intervention. Yet their scientific methods invariably focused on changing poor people's behavior rather than changing the conditions that created poor people. The multiplication of charitable organizations created a complex web of overlapping services that confused recipients while ensuring that no single organization took responsibility for addressing systemic causes of problems they all claimed to want to solve. Chapter 38. The Children's Legacy. By the mid-1850s, London's street children had created institutions that would survive their individual members, establishing traditions of mutual aid and democratic governance that continued despite constant pressure from authorities determined to suppress their innovations. Lucy Fletcher's leadership methods had been codified into procedures that allowed smooth transitions between different coordinators, ensuring continuity without dependence on particular personalities. The Children's Parliament had developed constitutional frameworks that balanced individual rights with collective responsibilities. Their economic systems had evolved into sophisticated mechanisms for resource sharing that included insurance functions, credit arrangements, and investment strategies that demonstrated remarkable financial understanding, despite their exclusion from formal banking systems. The children had developed their own educational curricula that emphasized practical skills while maintaining cultural traditions passed down through generations of street survivors. Their schools operated without buildings or official recognition, yet produced graduates whose capabilities often exceeded those of formally educated contemporaries. Bobby Walsh had become something like a professor of social organization, teaching newcomers how to participate in cooperative communities while maintaining relationships with external authorities. His diplomatic expertise enabled the children's community to survive hostile environments while preserving their internal autonomy. The children's innovations in conflict resolution had produced methods for addressing disputes that emphasized understanding over winning, reconciliation over punishment, and prevention over reaction. Their justice system operated more effectively than adult courts in producing outcomes that satisfied all parties while reducing future conflicts. Their medical knowledge included practical understanding of herbal remedies, first aid techniques, and preventive health measures that often proved more effective than professional medical treatment available to poor families. The children had become their own doctors, teachers, and social workers, yet their achievements remained invisible to official society, which continued to classify their activities as criminal conspiracy rather than social innovation. Police raids continued disrupting their meetings. Workhouse officials continued hunting them like dangerous animals, and charitable organizations continued trying to rescue them from communities that provided better care than institutional alternatives. The children's success in creating functional alternatives to dysfunctional systems threatened the ideological foundations of Victorian civilization, proving that human beings could organize themselves according to principles of mutual aid rather than hierarchical domination. Their legacy would influence future social movements despite receiving no official recognition, as their methods and insights spread through informal networks of people who had experienced their communities firsthand or heard about their achievements through personal contact. Chapter 39. The Final Winter. The winter of 1855-1856 marked a turning point in Victorian London's relationship with poverty, as accumulated evidence about social conditions finally began generating political pressure for systematic reforms. Yet this turning point also revealed the limits of reform within systems designed to benefit from the problems reform was supposed to address. Dr. Blackwell's medical research had gained support from influential politicians who recognized that disease didn't respect class boundaries, that epidemics starting in poor districts could spread to wealthy neighborhoods, and that public health required attention to conditions throughout the city rather than just in affluent areas. Parliamentary committees had produced reports acknowledging connections between housing conditions and health outcomes, working conditions and social stability, educational opportunities and economic development. These reports provided intellectual justification for reforms that humanitarian arguments had failed to achieve, yet proposed reforms consistently focused on regulating rather than eliminating the conditions that created problems, managing rather than solving systematic failures, treating symptoms rather than addressing causes. The political system seemed capable of acknowledging problems while remaining incapable of implementing adequate solutions. Housing reform proposals included minimum standards for overcrowding and sanitation, while maintaining landlord property rights that prevented more fundamental improvements. Working condition reforms included limits on child labour and maximum hour requirements while preserving employment relationships that kept workers dependent on employers. Educational reforms included expanded access to basic instruction, while maintaining curricula designed to prepare poor children for subordinate positions rather than leadership roles. These reforms represented genuine improvements, while ensuring that improved conditions didn't threaten fundamental social arrangements. Mary O'Connor's family experienced some benefits from these incremental changes. Slightly better housing regulations, marginally improved working conditions, expanded access to medical care. Yet their basic situation remained essentially unchanged despite official acknowledgement of problems. The family continued living in overcrowded conditions, working for inadequate wages, struggling with insufficient resources to meet basic needs. Reform had made their suffering slightly more tolerable, without making their circumstances fundamentally different. Lady Pemberton celebrated these reforms as evidence of social progress and moral advancement, interpreting gradual improvements as proof that charitable work and political advocacy were successfully addressing society's problems. Her satisfaction with incremental change reflected her distance from the daily realities that reforms were supposed to address. The gap between modest reforms and massive problems revealed the limitations of working within systems designed to benefit from the very conditions that reform supposedly sought to change. Real solutions required more fundamental changes than existing institutions were willing or able to implement. Chapter 40. The Mirror's Reflection. As our journey through Victorian London's architecture of suffering draws toward its conclusion, we must confront the uncomfortable recognition that this story hasn't ended. It has simply learned better disguises and developed more sophisticated justifications. The machinery that created Mary O'Connor's misery and Lady Pemberton's comfort continues operating with updated technologies but identical logic. The fog that choked London's poor has been replaced by environmental pollution that still affects poor communities disproportionately, while wealthy neighbourhoods remain relatively protected. The cold that killed Victorian children has been replaced by different forms of neglect that achieve similar results through more complex mechanisms. Contemporary poverty operates through systems more elaborate than Victorian ones, yet the fundamental mathematics remain unchanged. Resources concentrate upward, while suffering pools in the lowest places. Modern charity resembles Lady Pemberton's philanthropic activities more than we care to admit, providing temporary relief while avoiding structural changes that might reduce the need for charitable intervention. We've learned to hide inequality more effectively, to justify suffering more sophisticatedly, to manage problems more efficiently, yet we haven't learned to eliminate the conditions that create problems in the first place. Our technologies for producing abundance have advanced dramatically, yet our commitment to sharing abundance remains tragically limited. The children's innovations in cooperative economics and democratic governance remain relevant to contemporary challenges, yet their insights receive no recognition in policy discussions dominated by assumptions about human nature that their achievements contradicted. Their knowledge about community building and mutual aid could inform current social policies if we were willing to learn from sources our institutions prefer to ignore. The distance between Mary O'Connor and Lady Pemberton wasn't geographical but moral. The vast expanse of a social system that treated human worth as a commodity, determined by market forces rather than inherent dignity. That same distance persists in contemporary forms, measured now in different currencies but representing identical failures of imagination and commitment. Every winter since 1855 has tested humanity's capacity to learn from its own history. to apply accumulated knowledge about social organization toward creating conditions that serve everyone rather than privileged few. The tools for ending preventable suffering have improved dramatically, yet preventable suffering continues because the will to use those tools universally rather than selectively remains uncertain. This story demands that we examine our own reflections in history's unforgiving mirror, asking whether we're perpetuating inherited systems that concentrate benefits while dispersing costs, or creating new ones based on principles of universal human dignity and shared responsibility. The choice remains as urgent now as it was in Victorian London. Will we choose to be Mary O'Connor's allies or Lady Pemberton's successors? Will we commit ourselves to building communities based on mutual aid and cooperative economics? Or will we continue accepting competitive systems that require some people's failure to ensure others' success? The children are still crying in the dark, in different places with different voices but identical needs for recognition that their lives matter as much as any other lives. The question echoes across centuries. Who will we choose to be when we hear that crying? The winter is always coming, bringing challenges that require collective responses based on principles of universal care rather than selective charity. Climate change, economic inequality, political instability, social fragmentation. These contemporary winters demand the same qualities that allowed some Victorians to survive while others perished. Our response to these challenges will determine whether future historians write about our achievements in creating just societies or our failures to learn from previous generations' suffering. The choice remains ours, as it has always been, as it will always be. Remember their names when you can. Remember their stories always, and remember that every winter since has been our test. Will we finally choose to shelter each other from unnecessary suffering? Or will we continue huddling in our separate corners, pretending we don't hear the crying in the dark? The fog has lifted from London streets, but moral fog still obscures contemporary suffering. The children are still crying. The lights are still waiting to be turned on. The choice remains eternally ours. Epilogue: the echoes of time, years cascaded into decades, decades accumulated into generations, and the machinery that created Victorian London's particular brand of organised suffering adapted to new circumstances while preserving its essential characteristics. The stories of Mary O'Connor and Lady Pemberton became archetypal patterns repeated throughout subsequent history. Their relationship-defining template for how societies organize themselves around principles of selective concern and systematic exclusion. The O'Connor family line persevered through centuries of economic transformation, each generation facing new versions of ancient challenges: inadequate wages, precarious employment, insufficient housing, limited educational opportunities, and healthcare systems that treated survival as a privilege rather than a right. Their descendants encountered different technologies and vocabularies, yet fundamentally similar struggles for dignity and security. Bridget O'Connor's children found work in factories that offered marginally better conditions than Victorian sweatshops, while maintaining employment relationships that kept workers dependent on employer goodwill. Her grandchildren experienced industrial automation that eliminated some dangerous jobs while creating new forms of economic insecurity. Her great-grandchildren navigated service economies that promised advancement through education, while maintaining credentialing systems that reproduced class distinctions under meritocratic disguises. Her great-great-grandchildren confronted global economic systems that connected their local struggles to worldwide patterns of resource extraction and wealth concentration. Each generation of O'Connors developed survival strategies appropriate to their specific circumstances, yet inherited from previous generations the core knowledge that their security depended more on community solidarity than individual achievement, more on mutual aid than competitive advantage. The Pemberton legacy followed parallel trajectories, adapting aristocratic privilege to democratic institutions while preserving the essential function of wealth as a buffer against consequences that ordinary people faced daily. Lady Pemberton's descendants became leaders in modern industries, educational institutions, and political organizations that shaped social policies, while remaining insulated from those policies' effects on families like the O'Connors. Each generation of Pembertons learned sophisticated languages for justifying inequality. Meritocracy replaced divine right, market efficiency replaced natural hierarchy, personal responsibility replaced moral obligation, yet the practical arrangements remained remarkably similar across centuries of ideological evolution. Their charitable activities evolved through multiple organizational forms: private foundations, corporate social responsibility programs, non-profit management, venture philanthropy, while maintaining the essential function of providing help that didn't threaten the conditions creating the need for help. The street children's innovations in cooperative economics and democratic governance influenced numerous social movements despite receiving little official recognition, their insights passing through informal networks of activists, organizers, and idealists who recognized alternative possibilities in their achievements. Their methods appeared and reappeared in workers' cooperatives, intentional communities, social movements, and experimental organizations that challenged hierarchical assumptions about human organization. Their legacy lived on wherever people gathered to create alternatives based on principles of mutual aid rather than competitive domination. Yet their innovations remained marginalized by mainstream institutions that couldn't acknowledge their achievements without questioning fundamental assumptions about human nature, economic necessity, and social organization. The children's success in proving that cooperation was more natural than competition, that sharing increased rather than decreased prosperity, that democratic organization was more effective than authoritarian control. These lessons were too dangerous to incorporate into official curricula. Dr. Blackwell's medical research established patterns that subsequent generations of researchers would rediscover repeatedly: that poverty was deadlier than any disease, that inequality was more dangerous than any epidemic, that social conditions determined health outcomes more powerfully than individual choices or genetic inheritance. Her methodology inspired generations of social scientists who documented correlations between economic status and every measurable indicator of human welfare: life expectancy, infant mortality, educational achievement, mental health, physical development, and social mobility. Yet their evidence encountered the same resistance she had faced: acknowledgement without action, concern without commitment, analysis without application. The statistical precision of social science research made it increasingly difficult to deny inequality's effects, while the mathematical complexity of that research made it easier to avoid addressing inequality's causes. Each generation produced more sophisticated evidence about problems, while developing more elaborate explanations for why solutions remained impractical. Government committees continued producing reports that acknowledged problems while explaining why solutions required further study. Budget constraints prevented immediate action. Political considerations complicated policy implementation, and economic realities limited possible interventions. Meanwhile, entrepreneurs like Jeremiah Crook adapted their business models to changing regulatory environments while preserving the essential logic of extracting maximum profit from human necessity. Modern versions of his housing empire operated through complex corporate structures that obscured ownership while concentrating control, tax avoidance strategies that maximized private returns while minimizing public contributions, and political influence that shaped regulations to serve industry interests rather than public welfare. Contemporary slumlords employed sophisticated management techniques and legal strategies that made traditional forms of tenant organizing less effective, yet their basic business model remained unchanged, providing minimal services at maximum prices to people who had no alternatives. The persistence of these patterns across centuries revealed that individual personalities were less important than institutional structures, that moral education was less effective than systematic change, that charitable intervention was less powerful than political organization. The problems that Victorian London faced weren't historical curiosities, but continuing realities that had learned to wear different costumes while performing the same essential functions. The distance between contemporary Mary O'Connors and contemporary Lady Pembertons might be measured in different currencies: annual income rather than inherited land, 401k balances rather than portfolio dividends, zip codes rather than social titles. Yet the essential relationships remained unchanged. Some people's comfort continued depending on other people's discomfort. Some families' security continued requiring other families' insecurity. Some communities' advantages continued necessitating other communities' disadvantages. Modern technologies had created unprecedented possibilities for eliminating scarcity, ending preventable suffering, and ensuring basic security for everyone. Yet these possibilities remained unrealized because implementing them would require abandoning competitive systems that benefited those who controlled resource allocation decisions. The fundamental choice that Victorian London had faced, whether to organize society around principles of universal care or selective advantage, remained as urgent and unresolved as ever. Each generation confronted that choice anew, yet each generation received the accumulated wisdom of previous generations about what choices were possible and what consequences different choices produced. The street children's experiments in cooperative economics demonstrated that alternatives were possible, that human beings could organize themselves according to principles of mutual aid rather than hierarchical domination, that democratic participation was more effective than authoritarian control for solving complex social problems. Their legacy suggested that the choice between competition and cooperation wasn't determined by human nature, but by social arrangements, that the choice between individualism and community wasn't dictated by psychological necessity, but by institutional design, that the choice between inequality and justice wasn't mandated by economic law, but by political will. Contemporary social movements that organized around principles of participatory democracy, economic cooperation, and environmental sustainability were rediscovering insights that London's street children had developed more than a century earlier, proving that their innovations remained relevant to current challenges. Yet implementing those insights on larger scales required confronting the same resistance that Victorian institutions had offered. Acknowledgement that problems existed combined with insistence that solutions remained impossible. Appreciation for alternative values combined with commitment to existing arrangements. Admiration for moral ideals combined with allegiance to practical considerations. The winter that killed Victorian children continued arriving each year in different forms. Economic recessions that destroyed families, environmental disasters that displaced communities, political conflicts that scattered populations, social changes that undermined traditional support systems. Each winter tested humanity's capacity to shelter each other from unnecessary suffering, to share resources more equitably, to organize societies around principles of universal care rather than selective concern. The choice that Mary O'Connor and Lady Pemberton represented, between solidarity and separation, between community and competition, between justice and privilege, remained as fundamental to human social organization as it had been in Victorian London. Each individual, each family, each community, each society continued facing that choice daily through decisions large and small about how to respond to other people's needs and struggles. The answers that Victorian London had given to those choices had produced the suffering our story documented, yet they had also produced the innovations and insights that suggested different answers were possible. The children who had died in Victorian winters had not died in vain if their deaths inspired subsequent generations to create conditions that prevented similar deaths. The children who had survived through mutual aid and cooperative organization had not struggled in vain if their achievements inspired subsequent generations to build societies based on similar principles. The adults who had chosen to help rather than ignore, to include rather than exclude, to care rather than compete, had not sacrificed in vain if their examples influenced subsequent generations to make similar choices. The story of Victorian London was simultaneously a story about the past and a story about the present, a historical account and a contemporary challenge, a documentation of what had happened, and a question about what could happen if different choices were made. The fog that had hidden Victorian suffering from Victorian comfort had modern equivalents in media coverage that focused on individual stories rather than systematic problems, educational curricula that emphasized personal success rather than social responsibility, entertainment industries that promoted competitive rather than cooperative values. Yet the same communication technologies that could obscure contemporary suffering could also illuminate it. The same educational systems that could reproduce inequality could also challenge it. The same cultural institutions that could promote selfishness could also encourage solidarity. The tools for creating just societies had improved dramatically since Victorian times, yet their effectiveness continued depending on the will to use them for universal benefit rather than selective advantage. Technical possibilities had expanded enormously, yet political possibilities remained constrained by commitments to arrangements that benefited some people by disadvantaging others. The children were still crying in the darkness of contemporary winters, different children facing different versions of preventable suffering, yet expressing the same fundamental human needs for recognition, security, community, and hope. Their crying continued echoing across generations because each generation faced the same choice about whether to respond with universal care or selective concern. The lights that could illuminate that darkness were brighter and more numerous than Victorian London had possessed. Yet they remained unlit in too many places because lighting them required abandoning advantages that darkness provided to those who could afford private illumination. The choice that our Victorian ancestors had faced continued confronting their descendants. Would we finally choose to shelter each other from unnecessary suffering? Or would we continue huddling in separate corners, pretending we didn't hear the crying in the dark? History had provided enough evidence about the consequences of different choices to inform contemporary decisions. The question was whether we would learn from that evidence or continue repeating patterns that created predictable suffering for predictable populations while providing predictable benefits for predictable beneficiaries. The winter was always coming, bringing challenges that required collective responses based on principles of universal care rather than selective charity, shared responsibility rather than individual competition, democratic participation rather than hierarchical control. Our response to those challenges would determine whether future generations inherited societies organized around human dignity or human dominance, community welfare or individual advantage, justice or privilege. Remember their names when you can: Mary O'Connor, Patrick O'Connor, Bridget O'Connor, Tommy O'Connor, Bobby Walsh, Lucy Fletcher, and all the unnamed children who had struggled and died and occasionally triumphed in Victorian London's winter darkness. Remember their stories always, not as historical curiosities but as continuing realities that demanded contemporary responses, and remember that every winter since had been our test. Would we finally choose to organize societies around principles of universal human dignity? Or would we continue accepting competitive arrangements that required some people's failure to ensure others' success? Would we build communities based on mutual aid and cooperative economics? Or would we maintain systems that concentrated benefits while dispersing costs? The children were still crying. The lights were still waiting to be lit. The choice remained eternally ours, as urgent and consequential as it had been in Victorian London, as it would be for generations yet to come. The only question was whether we would choose differently than our predecessors, or whether future historians would write about our failures to learn from previous generations' suffering and previous generations' wisdom. The fog might lift from our streets as it had lifted from London's, but moral fog could obscure contemporary suffering as effectively as physical fog had hidden Victorian misery. The children's voices might change languages and locations, but their essential message remained constant: that human dignity required human recognition, that security required community, that justice required choice. The echo of Victorian London's winter nights continued reverberating through time, carrying forward both warning and hope, both caution and possibility, both evidence of what went wrong and insight about what could go right if different choices were made by people who had learned from history rather than simply endured it. In the end, every generation faced the same fundamental test that Victorian London had faced: whether to organize human relationships around principles of care or competition, sharing or separation, justice or privilege. The answers that each generation gave to that test determined the quality of life for all the children who cried in the darkness, waiting for someone to choose to light the lamps that would illuminate paths toward dignity, security, and hope. The choice remained ours. The children were still waiting. The winter was always coming, and the question was always the same: who would we choose to be when we heard that crying in the dark?